panel, bringing together academics, activists and witnesses, will provide an update on the current state of politics in Myanmar, discussing the suppression of democracy, the National League for Democracy, and Aung San Suu Kyi, the outbreak of civil war following the Spring Revolution, and the impact of the conflict on the country's ethnic minorities, particularly the Karen ethnic group, who are under a regular attack by military forces. I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, so I'll introduce our first speaker now. Dr. Alex Dzikalski is an associate professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin and director of the ECD Centre for Asia Pacific Research. His research and teaching cover authoritarian politics, human rights and Asian politics, and his most recent book is Making the World Safe for Dictatorship and was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Yeah, do you want to start, Alex? Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this, and I'm really happy to see that we have a turnout. We did not do this on purpose, but it happens to be organized on Armed Services Day of the Myanmar military, so they're celebrating their own coup in Myanmar today. So I think it's useful for us to, in our own small way, give a little bit of a counter narrative to what's occurred. So as my colleague Teresa mentioned, on February 1st, 2021, the military perpetrated a coup. Military trucks surrounded political buildings, and the military announced a state of emergency. The country's most popular leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, was arrested and subsequently charged with a long list of basically made-up crimes, and she remains in incarceration now. Leaders were replaced by those loyal to the military. The ostensible rationale for this was that the 2020 election featured irregularities and was rigged, basically. We'll come back to that in a moment, but that was the stated rationale, right? Then you see resistance is stoked, both nonviolent initially and then violent resistance to the coup. And the subsequent crackdown has caused thousands of deaths. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'll be relatively brief, and I just want to make three main points about the coup and where we stand in terms of the military in politics. The first point is that we've seen a military dominance of politics in Myanmar for a long time. The second is that the population does not want military rule. And the third is that the entire coup and military rule is sustained by violence. So first, military dominance of politics in Myanmar. Basically, since at least 1958, the military has been the dominant political actor in Myanmar's politics and held really a dominant position in the country. From 1962 to 1988, as many of you will know, there was basically one-man military rule under General Min Aung Hlaing. So it was sort of a hybrid of a personalist regime, but the military was really his power base. From 1988, so that's a long time now. So we're talking more than a half a century. 1988 to 2010, you see junta rule. What do we mean when we say junta rule? Well, it was led by a group of top generals, but didn't have as much that personalist sort of cult of personality type quality that you saw in the Min Aung Hlaing rule. But nonetheless, the military was leading politics, right? It was controlling the country. As many of you will know, in 2011, you saw a liberalization. So the military liberalized on its own terms, started having elections, and many, myself included, were extremely skeptical about this. And so the opposition boycotted those elections, and the military kind of selected its own leader, basically. That leader, Thein Sein, turned out to be sort of a moderate reformer, right? So he liberalized some aspects of the country's politics, and visiting the country several times during that period, the liberalization was very notable in the center of the country, right? And so this period from 2011 to 2020 was sort of a hybrid, you could call it a hybrid regime, right? There were elections and civilian control over important parts of the country's politics, but the military still lurked in the background and indeed retained control over key ministries, and it reserved the right for itself to veto any constitutional changes and to return to power more or less whenever it wanted, right? So it was sort of this hybrid system, but it differed, I would argue, it differed quite substantially from outright military rule that we saw before 2011 and now. Okay, that interregnum, that kind of 10-year interregnum, was qualitatively different. And we can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. So why does all this happen? Well, the military sees itself as the savior of the nation, right? It sees itself as a sort of the only thing holding the nation together. Many have posited and commented about how the military sort of isolates itself from society, right? It has its own sort of parallel economic and social structures that lead it to not really understand or care to understand what society thinks about it, right? And so you see, I think a useful analogy is to think of it almost like an occupying force, right? That's trying to control a population that doesn't really want it there, actually. So that's the first point, military dominance in politics. The second is that the population does not want military rule. Okay? Any reasonably free and fair election in the last 35 years in Myanmar has shown a clear consensus against military rule. Okay? 1990 election, about 60% of voters preferred the pro-democracy, the National League for Democracy, which was opposing military rule, and about 21% supported the pro-military party, so 60% to 20%. Fast forward to 2012, there were by-elections for some seats that were open as a result of the new administration. 37 seats were open, and military candidates lost all 37. 2015, general elections across the country, 57% went for the National League for Democracy, 28% went for the pro-military party. 2020, the military annulled the election results, so we don't have raw vote totals, but there were a total of 1,117 seats that were selected at different levels of government, right? And the NLD, in other words, the non-military, pro-military party, won 920 out of those 1,117. That's 82% of the seats. Right? The pro-military party won 6.4% of the seats. So every single time in the last 35 to 40 years that the population has been asked whether they want military rule, the population has resoundingly said no. So it's very clear that some coups in the world are perpetrated with with widespread popular support. This is not one of them. So that's the second point. So we have military dominance of politics. The population does not want military rule. As a result, point three, the coup is sustained by violence. So because the coup is illegitimate and the population doesn't want it, the only way that it can continue is through force, through violence, right? And so it requires violence in order for the military to stay in power. You can look, I mean, there are lots of different ways you can look at this, right? One way is to look at the ACLED data set, which is a kind of a machine learning sort of data set that records all events in the world that relate to civilian violence and government violence. Okay? The year before the coup in military, the military coup in Myanmar, the 1 year before, the 365 days before, this project captured 605 events that were categorized as violence against civilians or remote violence like explosions and things like that against civilians. 605 events with 258 reported deaths the year before the coup. That's a lot, right? That's by no means was this a perfectly tranquil situation beforehand. The year after the coup, the 365 days after the coup, 5,190 events, 4,831 fatalities. Right? So you're looking at 20 times the fatalities the year after the coup versus the year before the coup. The most recent year, in other words, the year 365 days before our meeting today, 5,375 events, 6,200 deaths. Okay? So you see a drastic uptick by a magnitude of kind of 10 to 20 times in terms of the violence being perpetrated on civilians. Since the coup, the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners in Burma records, as of today, 20,846 political prisoners. 16,978 are still detained. Nearly 4,000 have been released, but released with still surveillance and other restrictions. So this is all just to say that because the coup is so unpopular, the only way to sustain it is massive and overwhelming force against the population, and therefore you see violence and repression being perpetrated against the population to that end. this doesn't even include things like civil liberties restrictions, censorship of the press, and so on and so forth. That's all in that's all occurring as well. So given the lack of popularity, the only way for the military to sustain itself in power is through violence and repression. Okay? So those are the 3 points that I would make, and I'll leave it there. I'm happy to follow up on anything in Q&A if you'd like. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. So we're going to take questions at the end, if that's okay. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and that's Zoya Pan. And I'm really delighted that she's able to join us over Zoom from London. Zoya will hopefully be known to most of you. She's from the Karen ethnic group in Burma and is a human rights activist, author, and campaign manager for the Burma Campaign UK. And she's worked tirelessly to expose the junta's human rights violations against the country's ethnic minorities. In 2009, she published her autobiography, Little Daughter, a memoir of survival in Burma and the West, recounting her childhood in Burma and on the border as a refugee and the impact of the assassination of her father, who was the Secretary General of the Crown National Union by Burmese agents in 2008. She's been recognised as a TED Global Fellow, a Women's Forum Rising Talent, and a World Economic Forum Global Leader. And she's won some recent success with Burma Campaign UK in arguing for and bringing about some targeted sanctions against the Burmese regime, particularly with regard to aviation fuel, and we can talk about that later. So thanks, Zoya, for joining us. It's our honour to have you. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Teresa and Alex. Thank you to UCD for this opportunity for me to speak to many of you today. It is really good to see many of you, and it shows you have interest on Burma, and I'm happy, to take part in this panel. Yes, it's been more than 2 years now since the attempted military coup in the country. There has been so many things going on during these 2 years, and over 2,300 people being killed, over 15,000 have been arrested, over 1 million people have been displaced across the country, and the Burmese military continue to attack civilians in different parts of Burma. But the situation now is so unprecedented that I have never seen before. On the one hand, the Burmese military continue to attack civilians and have mass arrests across the country, including political activists, politicians, and PDF members. On the other hand, the resistance against the military is growing every day. It's getting stronger and stronger. And for the first time in Burma history, the Burmese military is struggling for their survival. They are struggling very hard. They lost control. In the past, they control where the conflict takes place and where they want to attack and where they want to have ceasefire. But now they lost control over the country, and the resistance movement is getting stronger. When people talk about Burma, mostly people pay attention to what is going on in central part of Burma or in cities like in Naypyidaw, Yangon, Mandalay, and others. But not many people know what is going on in different ethnic part of Burma, where I am from. And in ethnic parts of Burma, we've been attacked by the Burmese military for decades. The Burmese military has been committing serious human rights violations against our people, including war crimes and crimes against humanity for decades, but not many people know about this. As we speak, people have been attacked in different parts of the country. The Burmese military is using airstrikes and long-range artillery, attacking civilians on a daily basis. People are hiding in the jungles. They become homeless. They are displaced. They're so desperate for food, medicine, clothes, and shelter. But one thing that I can feel from the people of Burma is they don't lose hope. They are so brave, courageous, and they keep going on. after the coup, when the military cracked down on the protesters, activists, and politicians, many of those young protesters, activists, and politicians, artists, they fled to different parts of ethnic states. They got shelter and they got support, and many of them received training, and they set up their own organizations, their own community. Many of them become People Defense Force, and many of them went back to their own places and carry on their resistance in different forms. And now the attacks by the Burmese military is taking place in different parts of Burma, including in urban areas, in Karen, Karenni, in Shan, in Kachin, in the West Chin, and in Mon State, and in central Burma, in Sagaing regions. And it's been going on for a while now. And many people, many young activists who involved in this, many of them are women as well. And so I really admire the spirit of this new generation. They really want to see real change in the country. They know that in the past years, when Thein government carried out a fake reform, it was only to get rid of international pressure. It has nothing to do with real reform in the country and to give people power and to have freedom for ethnic communities. And the government in Burma, they used this fake reform to get more international support, and they bought more weapons, especially the military. They bought more military equipment, weapons, and now they are using these weapons to attack civilians in different parts of the country. Last week, there were several airstrikes in Klalutu area, in Karen State, and in Duplaya, and also in Karenni State. And recently we saw more and more airstrikes in Chin State as well. In November last year, the Burmese military conducted a major airstrike in Kachin State during a concert celebrating the KIO Day. And it's killed more than 82 people in one airstrike. That's why we've been working very hard to raise this kind of international awareness and to get more international pressure on the military. We know that in the past years, the international community was misled by the fake reform in Burma. They were prepared to lift sanctions, and they were prepared to engage with the Burmese military. We don't want the international community to repeat the mistake again. Those mistakes has led to more attacks against our people, that led to genocide against the Rohingya, and then more war crimes and crimes against humanity against our people. We want more international actions. We want more targeted sanctions. We want sanctions that will target aviation fuel against the Burmese military. The Burmese military doesn't have technology to produce their own jet fuel. They relied on international companies and communities. If we can cut this jet fuel going into the Burmese military, it will help reduce airstrikes against our people. It will help deal with humanitarian crisis on the ground. We need to see more legal pressure against the Burmese military, who has repeatedly committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, violating international law. We need to see actions from the International Criminal Court. We need to see more support at the International Court of Justice. And at the same time, we need to see more international pressure to cut off the economic lifelines of the regime, including gas revenue, gems and timbers, and others. The Burmese military rely on trade and investment, and they use this money from gas revenue and others to buy weapons and military equipment from other countries, and they use that to attack our people. International community can help us by cutting all these economic lifeline of the Burmese military. We also need to see more political pressure against the military. For example, more at the UN Security Council and other countries. The Burmese military has been killing people in Burma, has been attacking us for decades, and there hasn't even been a global arms embargo against the military. It is unacceptable. I really hope that governments around the world can commit on global arms embargo against the Burmese military. The Burmese military is killing children, women, and elderly people. They must not be allowed to receive weapons and military equipments from the international community. We also need to see more humanitarian aid for the people in Burma. People in Burma suffer so much. And I know from my experience, I grew up in Burma. I was attacked by the Burmese military. We were attacked with air bombs and airstrikes. We were hiding in the underground bomb shelter. Each time the bombs dropped on the ground would shake. And as children, we were just so terrified. We had no choice, but we had to flee our country, our homeland. We walked through the jungle, weeks and weeks, days and nights. But for me, I'm lucky. I ended up in refugee camp in Thailand, where we had basic support from international communities, from NGOs. But many of my friends and other family, they were trapped in Burma. Many lost their life, and they desperately need help. That's why we need to see more humanitarian aid going into Burma and help those people desperately in need, especially in the marginalized areas. We need to see those NGOs and international community work with community-based organizations who work on the ground, who knows and understand what is happening on the ground, and who can reach communities there that other NGOs cannot reach. For example, through border-based communities crossing the border. Those communities work inside Burma because the Burmese military block humanitarian aid in the country, and NGOs inside the country cannot reach many of the marginalized areas. And the marginalized communities can be only reached through cross-border assistance. For example, from Thailand, from India, from Bangladesh, and from other countries in the border area. So it's very important that international community provide effective and efficient support for the people in Burma. People in Burma will do whatever they can to help free ourselves, but we cannot do it alone. We need your assistance. You can help us in many ways. If you look at Burma Campaign UK website, we have lots of actions that people can take there, for example, for the release of political prisoners and to get more sanctions on aviation fuel sectors, and then sanctions on gas revenue sectors. And we really need your help. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoya, so much for that, and for directing people towards resources that you rate as well, and organizations that you rate in terms of how to help most effectively, because the situation in Burma, as you've all picked up by now, is a chronic attritional one that's been unfolding kind of catastrophically over the past couple of decades, with a brief period of reprieve and hope followed by a collapse back again into authoritarian rule. And our next speaker, Declan Stokel, is going to touch on that a bit, because the consequences for the country's population in terms of healthcare, especially the internally displaced population, is very extreme, and they're a very vulnerable group right now. So I'm going to turn towards that really quickly. I'm going to play an interview I pre-recorded with Declan Stokel And just to introduce him, Declan is a junior doctor based in Sunderland in the UK who volunteers regularly with the American charity Free Burma Rangers, and his family are a friend of the Karen community. While last in Burma in autumn 2022, Stokel witnessed an attack on medical facilities and on innocent civilians by the Burmese junta. And as I mentioned, is joining the call via a pre-recorded interview to recount his experiences. And then after that call, then we're going to open the forum, open up the forum for discussion and questions. So if you can hear the video, Alex, give me a wave. But we did this earlier, it did work. So, okay.
So I've been to Myanmar and the border regions many times since I was very young, and I started studying to be a doctor in 2012, and I got the opportunity to go with the Free Burma Rangers during my elective to Karen State, to which is an ethnic group in the east of Myanmar, to work in a medical facility, volunteering there and training local medics. So I've been back to Karen State on 4 different occasions with the Free Burma Rangers to provide medical care and train medics in that region. I got 6 months off work, off my GP training program, in order to be able to go back in October, and I sort of got in touch with FBR again, and although the situation is a lot different now, following the sort of coup in 2021, where there was predominantly ceasefire agreements with most of the ethnic groups, I knew this time would be very different. There was active war in Karen State, and because of the COVID pandemic, I hadn't been for 3 years. So in October last year, I got the chance to go back, and I spent 6 weeks there working with the FBR medics, treating the local villagers in an inpatient facility and an outpatient facility, and training local medics so that they could go back to their villages and treat patients with in common sort of diseases and conditions that they see. And there's a huge healthcare problem in the ethnic areas of Myanmar. I think there's about 1 million or so people who live in Karen State, if not many more, and they don't have any doctors. They don't have any trained doctors in that area, so they're all medics. So there's a huge population there that don't get access to really good healthcare.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened last October when you were in Myanmar, and how this is different to other times that you've been there?
So, like I said previously, the 3 times I've previously been to this part of Karen State in Myanmar, there was a ceasefire agreement, so it was relatively safe. There was no real active war. There was a few skirmishes, but nothing that would really worry you in terms of fighting. I knew this was different. There was an active war at the moment. I knew there'd been lots of fighting in this area in particular of Karen State. So I knew that this was a lot more dangerous. Early on in the trip, I got a good idea of that. We had 2 jets come over camp very early on the trip, whilst I was teaching the medics, and I subsequently found that they'd been bombing some Karen areas close to the Thailand border. So there was lots of security protocols in place. There was lots of security information that we were given on a daily basis to try and keep ourselves safe. And things settled down during the trip. There wasn't any that we were still on high alert, but there wasn't any further jets coming over. There wasn't really fighting close to us at the time. But towards the end of the trip, one night that I went to bed, I was staying very close to the inpatient facility, the clinic, and the person I was staying with, another medic, I was staying with his family, he came up, shone a torch in my eye and said, "We need to go now." And at that point, you could hear the jets coming around camp, and you only hear them for a very short period of time because they're going so fast, but then they come back, so you know they're circling around the camp. And then you heard the bomb warning going off, which was the leader of the camp banging on a drum in the middle of the camp. So he took me down into the bomb shelter, and we stayed there for 3 or 4 hours with his old family and his 2 young children. And then it all went quiet. We'd heard bombs dropped, but we knew that they weren't on our facility. The bang wasn't loud enough for it to be in our camp, but it was close by. We then went back up into his house and sort of slept for another couple of hours, and then the next thing we heard was another plane coming. At that point, we all went back down to the bomb shelter, and then he basically told us he'd got message over his radio that this was a reconnaissance plane taking pictures. That lasted for a couple of hours, and then when it got light, the planes left, and we came out of the bomb shelter. And the reconnaissance plane really worried us because we knew that we were one of 7 villages in that region of Karen State, which were on the Burma Army's hit list. So they wanted to bomb us if they could. Now that really worried us because they were taking pictures of our camp, so they were trying to find the best way that they could bomb us, which really heightened things for the rest of the trip.
Can you describe the impact of this attack on the local community?
Yeah, I think when the sort of planes had left, the next few days, everyone left camp. Particularly on a night. During the day, women and children left the camp as well, and they moved to jungle facilities, makeshift camps that they'd set up in the jungle. During the day, the men stayed behind to manage the clinic and train the medics and get food. But women and children left basically day and night for the next couple of weeks. Now, this has a huge impact on many different things, but it has a huge impact on the healthcare of the population more than any other thing, I think, in my experience. We've seen a large increase in patients coming with pneumonia, particularly children. We've seen a large increase in mental health problems. We've seen a large increase in malaria and late presentations of illnesses. Many of the people in other villages had already left and were already in makeshift camps in the jungle. So we were seeing those people coming in over the weeks preceding the aerial attack, and so I knew that this was one of the consequences of the aerial attacks. But the other thing is on the day that after the attacks, we would usually have 40-50 patients coming into our outpatient clinic. We only had 1 patient turn up that day, and she really needed to be there. There was many others I'm sure needed to be there but wouldn't come. We had some very sick patients in our clinic. They all left because they know that was a target for the military. They know they target healthcare facilities, so they weren't prepared to stay. They took their chances, and they were very sick. They needed to be there. They were on, antibiotics to a drip. They were on oxygen, some of them. So it was a really, really, the impact of those aerial attacks on the healthcare of that region in a whole is huge, and it can't really be underestimated. These people are going out into the jungle. They're without nets for mosquito nets. They're without blankets. It gets really cold on a night. They haven't got facilities to boil their water. They don't light fires to boil their water, so they're drinking not safe water. And most of them weren't sleeping. We had a man who came in who hadn't slept for 3 nights, and was having more seizures. He was an epileptic. He was having more seizures because he wasn't sleeping, because of the risk of aerial attacks, particularly at night. So it was just so evident that how the health of this population was so affected by even the risk of the attacks happening. So yeah, that was my main take home from what I saw.
Had you ever seen this level of aerial attacks and bombardment on healthcare facilities before the coup in 2021?
So prior to 2021, we hadn't seen any aerial attacks in that region. This is something that's very, very new since the coup in Feb 2021. It was mainly ground attacks that the local population had witnessed, and those are much easier to avoid. These people know the terrain of that area. It's a very mountainous jungle area. They can escape a lot of ground attacks if they're given warning in time. You can't escape an air attack. It takes, a jet is in and out within 5-10 seconds. You don't get any warning with that. So you have to leave the place that you live. And a lot of people don't realize that the vast majority of people are in Karen state are actually displaced internally rather than displaced to another country. They don't really want to leave their country. They have farms, they have family, they have connections, they have a great pride for them. They're part of Myanmar. So they only leave as a last resort. So they will displace themselves internally to avoid being bombed from the air. But I certainly saw a huge change in terms of the Myanmar military tactics, and the fear and consequences on the healthcare of the Karen people was really evident.
Do you know what's happened to your colleagues and the community you were working with since you've returned to the UK?
So I know many of them are, even however many months on, are still living in the jungle. Now, I know that very, very recently a friend of mine's house was bombed with a direct hit, and that was maybe 2 weeks ago, about a mile away, less than a mile away from the clinic. So they are getting closer. People are really, really, really scared. Nobody was killed in that attack. They managed to get out and they were living in the jungle already. But it just shows that they're getting, the Myanmar military are getting better and better at finding their targets. And it's not going to be long, I think, before there's a real risk that they bomb the clinic and facility that we work in, which is astounding because it's a pure healthcare facility. It treats patients and trains medics up. So if you want to bomb that facility, then there's no limit to what you want to do.
Just before we end, do you have any final words for the audience that are watching now, and what it is that they could do to help?
I think Burma, Myanmar, the conflict there has moved away from the international media because of the other wars that are happening, particularly in Ukraine at the moment. And I think the people there who I talk to, the Karen people, the Burmese people who I talk to, are aware of that. They're aware that they're on their own here, and they've done, they've been at war on and off for 70 years. Many people in that country. I don't think they'll ever give up, but I think they need our support more than ever. Myanmar military is getting lots of support from Russia, China, India, and the international community, the so-called people who are supposed to be supporting these people, like America, Europe, Britain, the sanctions that they are imposing are very weak and they're not really getting to the people who they need to get to. So the most important thing which Burma campaign are fighting for is a sanction on aviation fuel, because I think they can, the local resistant movement is growing. It's not just ethnic areas now. There's people from the cities, mainland Burma, are joining the sort of resistant armies, and they will win. I think if it's a ground offensive, then the Burmese military cannot stay in control of the country. That's why they're starting to use air attacks, because it's the only way that they can win this war. So I think if we can get the planes out of the sky, and I think the only realistic way of doing that is to sanction aviation fuel, make sure they can't get the planes off the ground, and make sure that those who are supplying the planes to them, or the parts of the planes to them, are sanctioned. That's the only way that the military are going to fail in their mission.
Okay, that's where the interview ends. So thanks to Declan for joining us through a pre-recorded interview. He couldn't join us live. As he mentioned, he's a junior doctor, has a busy schedule. So that's where our panel ends. And now we've time for discussion. We've about 15 minutes left for discussion. Any questions that anyone wants to ask. So you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, or you can pop a question into the chat. So I see Dermot Lacey is straight off the bat there. Yeah, Dermot.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity and the presentations. I don't know an awful lot about the current situation, but I was a member of Burma Action Ireland when it existed more actively, and my brother helped found us. But the question I want to ask you is, I am a member of Dublin City Council and was one of, I think, only 2 or 3 councillors who voted against the rescinding of the freedom of the city to Aung San Suu Kyi. And there was lots of mixed messages at the time as to whether we should or shouldn't do that. I felt we shouldn't. But can I just ask, in general, what is the attitude to Aung San Suu Kyi at this stage? Because the messages I read all the time are very mixed. Don't know if that's a hard question or not.
Does anyone want to answer that for that question?
I mean, I can take a first stab. I mean, I think she's got a complicated legacy, right? So, you know, she clearly was an icon for democracy for a long period of time, and I mean, in my estimation, showed a huge amount of bravery in standing up to military rule for 20, 25 years, right? That was not an easy decision to make. But of course, you know, her legacy became a lot more complicated and controversial once she became a politician, right? So, you know, I know there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction in a lot of communities with her rule. There are criticisms about the way she ran the NLD as kind of a hierarchical sort of political party that maybe didn't internally adhere to the democratic aspirations that the rhetoric promoted. And of course, she defended Myanmar in front of the international community quite vociferously when it was perpetrating genocide against Rohingya. So, you know, her political legacy became complicated as a result of that. But I think the key thing to keep in mind always when it comes to Myanmar politics is that it's the military perpetrating this. Like, you know, in some ways, it was clever insofar as she took all the heat, basically, for a lot of the things that the military was doing when she had no realistic power to stop the military, even if she really, really wanted to, right? So I think it's complicated, but you know, others may disagree or might have a different view.
So yeah, did you want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I just would like to give a little comment. Yes, it's true. Not just people around the world were very disappointed with Aung San Suu Kyi and her decision and her actions and her policy, but also people in Burma, many people, especially within the ethnic communities, were very disappointed with her policy and her actions. There were areas where she could make a difference. For example, the release of all political prisoners, or opening up of humanitarian access to different ethnic areas. Of course, the Burmese military, the military was the main perpetrator, but Aung San Suu Kyi could make a difference if she really wanted to. And when she went and defended the Burmese military at the ICJ, she didn't need to do that. There was no requirement in the constitution for her to go and defend the military. She chose to do it. That's why many people in Burma were very, very disappointed and very sad and felt very betrayed by their leader. But there are still many people who follow her, who admire her, and who do whatever she wants and whatever she says. That shows how influential she is. People just do whatever she says. So if she used this moral authority and provide very principled leadership to the country, it will make a huge difference. And at the moment, she is in prison. She was arrested and detained and in prison. And of course, there are many political prisoners in Burma as well who needs to be released, who shouldn't be there. And that's why we've been calling for all political prisoners to be released. And for young generations in Burma, many of them during the past years, they had the opportunity to experience a little bit of political freedom. So they have their own political analysis, and they can they can see what is wrong and what is right. And for them, for many of them, now is the opportunity to win back freedom for the people in Burma, where everyone, regardless of our race, our ethnicities, our gender, and our political background, everyone should be treated equally in the country. And people in Burma, especially young people, are so determined to fight against this military regime and to rebuild the country with new hope and new political system. They don't want the international community to keep supporting the Burmese military, and they don't want the political leaders to compromise with the Burmese military. The only thing they want now is to dismantle the Burmese military, because we see Burmese military as the main obstacle for any kind of reform, any peace, or anything that can bring hope for the people in Burma.
Just one thing to add to answer very directly Dermot's question: what is the perception of her? There's no doubt she remains by far the most popular politician in the country. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Whatever you think about her policies, I mean, I think that's an empirical fact.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from the audience? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself or stick a question to the chat. You can ask questions of each other as well. Oh yeah, and Alex, yeah. I have a question if no one wants to go ahead. Oh, I see John has one. Yep.
Hey folks, thanks for the great event, by the way, Trasa, Alex, Soya. I was just wondering, like, to what extent the current tensions in Burma now are a legacy of colonialism, and is that talked about much?
I'll defer to Zoya first there. Go ahead.
A hard one.
Okay, thank you. People in Burma have mixed feeling about British colony in the country. On the one hand, you will see that the Burman, the main ethnic group, the Burman, of course, they didn't enjoy the colony because of so many repression and different reasons. But for many ethnic minorities, like the Karen and others, we saw British colony as a savior. saving us from the Burman oppression against our people. In the past, our people had been attacked and have been suppressed by the Burman kings for centuries. Many of our people were used as slaves. We were not allowed to speak our own languages. We were not allowed to teach our own history and have our own communities and developed our rights. But when British went to Burma and we benefited some of the political freedoms and social freedom under the British occupation, and many of ethnic communities joined the British Army, and then we involved in the Second World War, where the British at that time agreed and guaranteed autonomy for Karen and other ethnics. But after the war, the autonomy wasn't given to us. Instead, there was a change in politics in the UK, and the British government gave independence to Burma, the main ethnic, which is Burman. At that time, it was led by Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San. But the Karen and other ethnics felt that we were betrayed by the British. And the Burman, at that time, they saw the Karen and other ethnics as lackeys of the British. So we were targeted because of that. And the attacks, we've been attacked in many ways, in many areas. And until now, the attacks has never ended. It's been going on for decades, even after the Second World War. So that is basically, the legacy.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I think that, obviously it's complicated and there are lots of multiple factors, including structural and agency-based factors. I think with this particular coup and sitting here in 2021, the biggest explanatory factor is the agency of the military, basically. I mean, I think that's absolutely key. This was 100% a coup of choice. They just didn't like losing elections, and they were really, really bad at electoral politics. And if you talk to, did some interviews for a project some while ago with top leaders of the USDP, which is the pro-military party, very clear, they just have no idea how to be good politicians. Like, they think they're really popular and they're just mystified as to why people don't like them. And they're just not prepared to compete in the electoral sphere. And they realize kind of their only way to hold absolute power was a coup. So I think, the legacy of colonialism kind of sets a context, but it's really a decision-based coup, I would say.
Yeah, and let's not forget the vast amount of resources and capital that the military gets to access by taking control of the country, as well, as Zoya touched on. Burma is incredibly resource rich. Does anyone have any further questions? We've about 2 minutes to go. I wanted to ask a really quick question. It was just about the current, we'd like a couple of references to resistance movements as well, and growing resistance. What form are those resistance movements taking right now? Because as I understand it, when the Spring Revolution kind of broke out with on-street protests, it was a very vulnerable time for the city's protesters. They were incredibly brave. They risked being killed or thrown in prison. Has the resistance movement changed then? Is it using other kind of methods to sow discontent into protests? And what are those, as far as you can tell?
Sure, the resistance movement is getting stronger, and it became across the country now. There are so many forms. For example, in the cities area, ordinary people refused to pay electricity bill because they don't want their money to go into the electric energy that will benefit the military, and people stop buying military products and brand, for example, like Myanmar beer and others that are directly controlled by the Burmese military and their cronies. And in the resistance area, they use different forms. They use armed struggle. In the armed struggles, they have guerrilla warfares, as well as positioning warfares. They use different types of warfares in the jungles as well as in the urban areas. And peaceful protest continue across the country as well in different parts in the cities. And yeah, we see so many forms of resistance against the military that we had never seen before. So this is very unprecedented. That's why it is a very good opportunity for us to regain our freedom. That's why we desperately need international support to help our people. One thing that international community needs to understand is that the problem in Burma is politically rooted. Whether democratic or military or dictatorship, they always refused to accept Burma as a multi-ethnic, multi-religion country. They refuse to allow us to enjoy our own freedom, to learn our own language, learn our own history, and have our own culture. They want everyone to be one race, one language, and one religion, which is not acceptable. This is for ethnic people. We are struggling for our freedom, for our autonomy, as well as our survival.
Thanks, Zoya. Yeah, and I'm sure most people on the call know, but there are 8 kind of major ethnic groups in Burma, but technically over 135, each with a rich sense of culture, history, identity, distinct languages as well. And as you said, it's this kind of attempt to suppress all of those differences and kind of subsume them into one identity is unacceptable. Yeah, Alex, did you have any final points to add there?
No, I think in the interest of time, we'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, we're just at 1 minute past
organizing
2. Yeah, so thanks to Zoya Pan for joining us from London, to my colleague Alex Tukalski, and to Declan Stokel, who joined us for your pre-recorded interview, and to all of you for attending. If you want to know more about the Centre, I've just posted Centre for Asia Pacific Research. I've just posted a link into the chat. Also, if you want to follow up with Zoya Pan and with Burma Campaign UK, I've posted the link into the chat as well. And please do take a look at their website before you go donating money to any NGOs or groups who claim that they do work in Burma. Do try, as Zoya said, to send money to groups who are working on the border with grassroots organisations as well. So thank you all for your time today. I hope we informed, stimulated, raised awareness of the situation in Myanmar, and hopefully we'll see you again for our next talk in the series.